everybody, Max and Brian here for Up at Noon, and we are joined by Neill Blomkamp. You may know him from the director of District 9, Elysium, and Chappie, and now he's working on something strange and experimental, which is Oats Studios. Neill, can you tell us what the hell you're doing over there?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure it out myself. I think what we're doing is our long-term goal is to try to create a studio that is funded directly by the community, if there's anyone out there that likes the stuff that we're making, and just fuels us to make more. So that's the long-term goal. What we've done at the moment is spend our own money to kind of start putting some films and some ideas out there and sort of feel how they go.
Now, you started distributing movies on Steam, basically. You made a bunch of short films kind of going in all different directions. You've done some fantasy, some sci-fi. And you've been selling like DLC packs for short films. How does that work exactly?
Well, you have to take like a slight step back, I think, for the DLC stuff to make sense. So if you think of game companies as being these sealed little kind of biospheres that make content, they make all this cool shit, and then they sell it directly to the audience that likes the stuff that the studio is making. They have this one-on-one relationship. And so I actually looked at Steam and Origin and stuff as these places where you could potentially make a film studio that kind of did something similar. But I was aware of the fact that we may not be able to initially to charge for the kind of weird content that we were making, that people may feel like, without knowing what it was, that it could backfire because people are like, it's too weird, or the length is strange. The storytelling is kind of like you just cut 20 pages out of the middle of a script, what's before, what's after. So I thought if we released everything for free, it would sort of let them know what we were attempting. And then over time, we would begin to try to charge for it, but it would actually mimic games almost more than film. And when we started thinking about it like from a game perspective, it was like, well, why don't we just sell the assets that we used in VFX, or give them away, or like give away the music or the stems to the music if there's composers who want to play with it. We even thought about giving away just like the raw footage so people could recut stuff. It's kind of just trying to break it apart into a different way that like a smaller digital studio making films could operate. And we don't exactly know yet.
It's a really interesting approach to sort of concept creativity and also business, and we don't really see a lot of it from successful video game companies. Actually, what happens a lot in video games is a company will go out of business or a game will close and they'll say, here's all of our stuff. But it's rare to see that in film. I remember like someone like, Trent Reznor did that with album stems through 9 Inch Nails. I believe Radiohead's done something similar.
Right.
Was there sort of any sort of animosity or pushback from the community in terms of you coming from kind of like a studio film background and then going to something that's a little more kind of intimate and crowdsourced, where people are like, well, he's made blockbuster movies. I mean, he's got the money, he can take care of it.
Well, I mean, the pieces that we've put out so far are definitely pretty expensive to make. So I've, kind of used up resources that I had to be able to do that, which is why I want to try to see if we can finance Firebase through the community now. But I don't think there was any backlash in what you're describing. I think we also started to feel like Steam was maybe not entirely the best place for video, although I still want to test that. I mean, at some point I still want to start actually selling something on Steam that is narrative 2D linear film and see what happens. But it's I think a better way to think of it is like, everybody understands how Hollywood and entertainment as it stands right now in the linear passive viewer arena, how that works. So I can go to Hollywood and make a film if I want to, and I do want to. I'll keep doing that. But there's something very interesting and kind of compelling to me about the idea of building a small studio where everyone in it is hired to be there all the time. And in a perfect world, we would be putting out ideas continuously, and we would be making sequels to some of the ideas continuously. And that means that we would be in pre-production and production and post-production in this like miniature kind of live action version of Pixar. And that means that everyone is under one roof, right? Like, they're not like, it's not the nomadic usual sort of freelance contractor-based way that the film industry works, where everyone's just sort of scattered to the wind when the production is done. So you work with your team, and you get to like you really kind of make this filmmaking family. And then if there are people out there that like this sort of science fiction, horror, fantasy stuff that we want to make, it seems like it should theoretically work. That it's like, well, could the community just give us enough resources for us to just make this and give it back to them? And I love that challenge. I just think that's a very cool thing.
No, so this is interesting because you're like the Firebase, which is the sort of Vietnam War movie, monster movie that you're crowdfunding for. The first episode of that is already out there, and for $5, people can download like massive high-res 3D files of the monsters from the film and make their own horror movies. What's next for Firebase?
Well, so Firebase is. During the creation of that idea, I kind of began to realize that it's actually a film about Gnosticism. It's incredibly based in Gnosticism, which by default means that it's about simulation hypothesis. And when you start mixing that with the Vietnam setting and the way that in Gnosticism you have these kind of malevolent entities that are non-physical called archons, and they tend to sort of swarm around misery or suffering. So the idea that they would be around terrible wars is something that was very intriguing. So what more we have planned for it is kind of going down that road of how the elements in Firebase came to be. So that's what we're trying to crowdfund.
It's interesting looking at like how Oats is approaching and putting out new stuff, because you guys do have a lot of sort of balls in the air at all times. You've got like Racco, which is about lizard people, aliens, and Pretoria, which is like space fantasy, and then there's Gdansk, which is giant slayers, and there's like all these different kind of themes out there. What's making you pick one over the other to pursue next? Is it just kind of where your head's at?
It is a little bit. I mean, Firebase is almost one of the most challenging in terms of the resources required to pull it off, because we need Hueys. We have to build Vietnamese, or American forward operating bases in the jungle. We have to get the crew into the jungle. So it's much more demanding than something like Zygote, where you're in one location. It also, from a VFX standpoint, it's a whole bunch of different kinds of VFX. It's not one repetitive, sausage factory kind of setup. So the reason to take on something a little bit more ambitious like Firebase is because I think the story that we have and where we want to go is genuinely very compelling. So, and one thing to kind of explain to anyone who's considering helping fund this new weird 21st century studio is that hopefully we raise enough that we make a feature film, which is unlikely, but that's obviously the goal. If we don't, we'll just scale back. Like we'll take our existing 120-page script and either rewrite it to form to the right amount of dollars, or sort of excise the amount of pages that fit the right amount of dollars. So we'll sort of tailor make it depending on what we raise. And that's why I keep saying, like, if we make all of $40, I'll shoot a cat video in wearing like military garb. Hopefully we can shoot a trilogy, but we'll see where that goes.
A trilogy of cat videos.
Never-ending cat videos.
Yeah, that's one of the really fascinating things I think we're seeing right now with sort of artistry and movie making and creative mediums in general, is that the historically kind of rigid guidelines of what something is are being destroyed in the best way possible. And a lot of the old guard, there's kind of some animosity about that. Some directors are saying that movies shouldn't be eligible for awards unless they're released theatrically. But how do you feel about the future of filmmaking in terms of how it's changing, about how malleable it is, and how long or short a movie has to be to even be considered a movie, and how it's distributed and all that?
Well, I mean, for me personally, it's really something that is actually pretty exciting. I mean, clearly, like based on the fact that, we're putting out weird 2-minute giant videos that are entirely computer generated. I mean, going into live action that's 25 minutes long, or the features that I've done, I'm very adaptive and into that idea. But I think my summary would be, if as a director, you would always pick that audiences watch your film at 4K in a movie theater.
Right.
It's with, I mean, you want it to just be the best experience that it can be. But you're fighting against, you're pushing against a tide that you're not going to win. I think if you think that the sort of change in how content reaches everyone that watches it now, and the abundance of mobile devices and the sort of shorter attention spans to pieces of narrative footage, every single thing is shifting. I mean, even some of the pieces that we did in Oats that we created in a game engine, like the Atom pieces, which are real time, those are 100% real time at 30 FPS running on like a fairly high-end game computer, right? So what that means is actually kind of astounding if you start thinking about that from a storytelling standpoint, and it's completely live. You can walk around in there. So we didn't solve that, we just made a single video, but some filmmaker or some game designer or a combination thereof will solve the narrative way to kind of bridge that and use real time in a kind of slightly new form of storytelling.
Well, I was going to ask, that's my next question, is you're distributing movie-shaped media on a primarily game platform on Steam, and your movies historically have a lot of kind of video gamey elements to them, and then you're partnering with Unity to make movies in a game engine. Why not just make a game?
I am drawn to the idea of making a game, but I do think that at my core, and definitely the older I get, it's the narrative campfire element of like of telling a story and it being about story and character delivered to the audience. Like you can look at filmmaking as something that can be the filmmaker's perception of reality, where you're seeing reality through their eyes. You know, and I think I'm sure there's 100 different ways to do it, but for me, I love the idea of trying to make people see things the way that I see them, and I think that's what most creative people do. And I'm totally drawn to the idea of making games. Like I really am. There's actually a hyper violent medieval setting for a game that I keep talking about inside the company. But it still isn't the same kind of all-encompassing creative sort of payoff that I get from doing something that is a narrative, passive, audience-based experience. Well, it's a different thing.
There's something really funny about opening up, like making something that is a linear, and you are serving the audience with entertainment, but at the same time opening up the assets to them to dump into Steam Movie Maker, or to kind of effectively putting out virtual action figures that kids can go in the backyard and play with. Yeah. Have you seen anybody taking the assets you've distributed on Oats and creating something new entirely?
I've seen some stuff. It's not that extensive though. But I think initially with Oats there was this confusion where what I tried to make clear was the idea that instead of being a studio that just like grabs the IP and then holds onto it and ties it up with like lock and chain, it was more a case of by sort of just releasing it, it's like whoever in the community is into this can do whatever they want from it. If you end up making like a bunch of cash, you should give us a percentage because that seems fair. But if you don't, if it's just for fun, go to town. And if it is for commercial reasons, also go to town. Just speak to us about giving us a portion of cash.
Sure.
But people misinterpreted that, I think, to be something where it was like, if you have ideas for scripts, we'll finance films that you want to make, which is like not at all what we want to do. We want to generate stuff, and then we want to just let whoever in the community is into it go crazy. So to be the equivalent of me when I was a kid, if I got my hands on the T-800 skeleton from like Terminator, and it was like I could download it and use it somehow. That's sort of the philosophy.
Right. Instead of you like pitching James Cameron on a new Terminator movie.
Or pitching James Cameron on like a random idea that I have that has nothing to do. It's like no, that's traditional filmmaking. You should go to like Warner Brothers or something and pitch that, not Oats.
I would actually be interested in that pitch nowadays, from you specifically. Right.
Yeah.
But I do think that's interesting that you're not making video games, but you are sort of ticking that box of interactivity by releasing those assets for people to explore and create with on their own. So much of video games nowadays are sort of user-generated. So much of the stuff that we're seeing in video games is people creating assets and creating things on the fly. I mean, look at something like Minecraft is one of the most popular games of all time, and it is, it's a game that delivers a world to you and then basically says, destroy it and rebuild it. What's your like kind of personal history with video games? Because it seems like as Max implied, the common elements creep into a lot of stuff. But like, were you always playing video games as a kid? Do you still play video games now?
Yeah, pretty much. Up until about a year or two ago, it started to die off just because of how much work, like sort of being 50% in Hollywood and then being 50% like all consuming Oats. Like, I mean, you know, back when we were in a different office, we would play Counter-Strike, which is probably my favorite game, every Friday. And that started to like die off just because of the nature of like how turbulent things are at the moment. Mm-hmm. So I've been so busy in the last year, I haven't really been playing. PUBG is the only thing that I've kind of messed around with, really, I would say, in the last year. But I would definitely say that first-person shooters in the most graphically realized environments are probably my favorite. So, you know, and the games that probably had the biggest effect on me would be Half-Life from Valve.
Oh, cool.
That would probably, you know, Half-Life 1 and 2 were probably the most hours in anything were probably those. And then when I was a kid, I was just talking about Mortal Kombat actually upstairs before I came down here. But it was like the standard stuff that someone growing up in like, you know, the 80s or 90s would be playing. I pretty much played all of it. Doom was a huge deal, like a big deal to me.
I can see your affinity for cool ass weaponry in your movies and you know, slime and mech suits and all that. Obviously, it's cool to see a generation of filmmakers who have grown up with video games and they're not just seeing games as some kind of like a bastard medium. Would you ever want to helm a video game movie? I know you were attached to Halo for a minute.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, totally. You know, the problem, what tends to happen is it's like the video game titles are so valuable that I think the studios get really nervous about how those adaptations happen. And then it feels to me, I don't know for sure, but it feels like they kind of weigh in on the filmmaking process in a way that isn't constructive to the filmmaking process because it's something that is like sacred within the game.
Right.
And it's like you can't really do it that way. You have to modify what you're doing for the screen in a passive, you know, 2D environment slightly differently. But the answer is yes. I mean, you know, I actually there's a lot of sort of time that I spend thinking about how cool Halo would have been to have actually followed through and worked on. I love the world of Halo and a whole bunch of other video games as well. Are, you know, very compelling. It's just more a case of like if you can cut through how bureaucratic it could be getting to, you know, make something really creative. It could be quite difficult.
Well, yeah, I was going to say audiences have sort of a preconceived notion of what those games are and how they should become movies. And I imagine that kind of stifles creativity, especially when you have studio people and people at the top of the video game companies being like, this is our vision and you can't go too far. I mean, and your work is berserk in the best way possible. And I think you're allowed to swim around in the world that you create and implore. Whereas I think like video games can be, I don't know, it seems like there's a kind of defined way where we are already expecting for those stories to be told. And I feel like we see this problem with video game movies all the time. Like things go wrong.
You could. I mean, it's quite interesting because obviously from the film studio's perspective, it's going to be a case of like reaching audiences beyond the game. That's where their mind is going to be.
Yes.
And then the game studio is going to be making sure that you hold the filmmakers to the sacred like logic of the game. But so this doesn't necessarily work really for the film studio. But what you could do is something where you kind of open up a discussion, like in a much more sort of like, you know, open language way of posing questions before you get into production about like, we're thinking of this, and let the community tell you, like let the community sort of guide some of those choices. The film studio then would be like, well, that isn't for everyone else who doesn't know the game, you know, so you could kind of run into issues that way. But it feels like you would want to kind of you would want to see if it felt like something that was really good for audiences that didn't know the game and something that also felt like the game lovers really understood and got, then you're in a good place. Halo has a naturally, I think, quite an archetypal setup and story that could make it, I think, kind of emotional and quite powerful if you got to the core of it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Well, in the meantime, until you get your hands on a video game franchise to make a cool movie out of, where can people look into Firebase?
So if anyone watching this has seen the first Firebase and they want more, please fuel us to make another one. And you can go to oatstudios.com and there'll be like we call it fuel, but it's like, you know, it's our funding part of our site, and just give us cash to make more Firebase for you.
Yeah, and if people want to download giant multi-gigabit assets of monsters and skeletons and nightmarish things, they can just go on Steam. I downloaded
on Steam,
the thing from Zygote. It was $5, so I don't. Can I 3D print that? Is that allowed?
Yeah. I think I haven't been on there lately, but I think we made like a SolidWorks version, or there's some version that is 3D printable. Definitely of the Clume, which are the aliens from Raqqa. But yeah, if you can reverse engineer the 3D mesh from Zygote, you can 3D print it to your heart's content. That's a very dense mesh, that creature.
I love what you're doing. You're like, yeah, I make movies. Here, take the pieces of them and play with them at home. Do it yourself. Neill, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. It's really cool, really weird what you're doing, and I hope you continue to do more of it.
Yeah, absolutely, man.
Yeah, thank you guys. No, it's awesome for us to help get this word out there. So I'm very appreciative. Thank you.
Sweet.
Cool, and keep making just awesome, bleak, gory, violent sci-fi because we love it.
Okay, wonderful. Cool. Okay, thanks guys.
Thank you.